Okay, welcome to part two of our research process mega lecture, and this time we will be talking about identifying and working with key variables in our research designs. So, we've already covered steps one and two, where we find a research idea and turn it into something we can test, something we can work with. So, this mini lecture is going to be about identifying our key variables. So, let's start with a little bit of terminology, and then we'll get into different kinds of variables. So first, you're going to hear the terms variables, values, and scores quite a bit over the course of this class. You've already heard variables a lot, and scores probably just a bit behind that. So what do those terms mean? A variable, we've talked about a little bit already. A variable is a condition or characteristic that people or contexts or situations can differ on. So almost anything you can think of could be a variable if either people or situations or environments can differ on. So with people, we're usually interested oftentimes in things like people's age, people's sex, their IQ, what color their eyes are, what their political orientation is. In quantitative research, which is what we focus on this semester, we're going to be measuring at least one variable using those operational definitions that we've talked about. And oftentimes we're going to manipulate at least one as well. We have special names for those types of variables, which we'll see in just a minute. But when we talk about values, what we mean is every possible score that a person or environment or situation could have on whatever variable we're looking at. So every score that's possible is the sum of the values on that variable. Scores are oftentimes numbers. Oftentimes we represent variables as having more or less or being higher or lower on that variable. But sometimes they're categories. If your variable is what state someone was born in, some people are going to say Arkansas, some people would say Texas, I'd say New York. Um, and those are, again, your values in that case are not numbers, but they're categories. They're the names of different states. So here's a bunch of numbers. Those could be examples of values. And here we see our categorical example, eye color. We don't attach numbers to it. We put people into categories. But the values for each variable is every possible score that someone or something could have. So what's a score? A score is each individual person or situation's value on that variable. So for example, on the variable of age, the values range from 0 to, we'll say, about 120. That's about the longest people go. So those are our values. Those are your possible scores. My specific individual score is 40. That's what my value is on that variable. Your age would be your score on that variable. So scores are generally what we're actually interested in because that's the data we're actually getting. Values just define the possible scores we could have. The scores are the actual measurements that we're taking, the actual values that we're looking at. So let's look at an example study and see if we can identify the different variables, values, and scores. So here's our premise. Some researchers were looking at whether or not celebrities would be more narcissistic. If you haven't heard of narcissism, it means you have an elevated self-opinion, kind of vain, that sort of fun stuff. But they thought celebrities would have more of this narcissism than people with different social statuses. So they took 200 celebrities, 200 grad students, 200 school teachers, and they measured their narcissism. They did this using what's called the Narcissism Personality Inventory. And a person's score on that measure can range from 0 to 40. Here we see some means. Mean is just a statistical term for average. This is the average score in each group. We see some numbers there. So I'm going to do this like a children's show where I'm going to call out questions to you and ask you to say the answer out loud, even though neither one of us can hear each other at that point. So just call it out. See if you can identify the variables in this study. What are some things in this description that can vary that were of interest to these researchers? I'll tell you there's two of them. So I'm going to move ahead. Again, if you want to take a little more time to identify these, just pause the actual movie when I do, but we're going to move ahead. So we have two variables here. One of them is that personality variable of narcissism. That's one thing that people can vary on that they're interested in. The other is identified as social status. People can differ on that as well. And we're seeing if there's a relationship between those two variables. So narcissism and status are our two variables. They're the two things that in this case people can differ on. What are the values? Take a moment and identify that. All the possible scores on narcissism and all the possible scores on social status. I'll tell you that one of those is spelled out pretty clearly in the description. The other one's a little harder to find. Pause for a second. Okay, if you don't have it yet and you'd like to get it, pause me. I'm gonna spill the beans here. So the one that's clearly defined is your narcissism personality inventory. Here we say people can score from 0 to 40. Those are your values. That's it. Can't get below 0, can't get higher than 40. That's how the questionnaire works. The only possible scores are from 0 to 40. For social status, that's a little trickier, because if you tried to list every possible social status someone could have, you'd probably come up with hundreds, if not thousands, of different answers. So rather than try to do that, we simply say the values are every possible social status someone could hold. So for narcissism, it's those clearly defined numbers. For social status, it's every possible status. So what are the scores? What are the scores that we have on our narcissism variable, and what scores do we have on our status variable? Those are the things that are the values that are actually present in this study. Again, pause for a moment. Okay, if you want to figure it out, pause me. So again, I'm going to move forward here. So the actual scores here for our narcissism scale, notice that we don't have individual scores. We have average scores, but that's usually what we care about in research anyway. But we see the average score for celebrity, 17.84, 16.18 here, and so on. For social status, we have 3 different scores that show up in the study, and those are our 3 categories that we're putting people into: celebrities, graduate students, school teachers. So those are our 3 different scores that show up in this study. So variables, values, and scores, it's not something that you'll necessarily be tested heavily on, but those terms are going to come up a lot. You'll want a good grasp of what they mean. It'll kind of help everything else make a little bit more sense. So let's move on and talk about our 3rd step of research, where we identify the factors we want to work with. So again, a variable is anything that can vary. People or environments or situations can vary on it. Lots and lots of possible variables, but researchers try to isolate the ones they're the most interested in. Remember that idea of parsimony? Parsimony includes looking at as few variables as possible while still getting the information that we want. In an experiment, the most common type of research, which we'll learn a little bit more about in future lectures, but in an experiment we have special categories of variables called the IV and the DV. I'm going to talk about IVs and DVs a lot as the semester goes along. So what do you need to know about IVs and DVs? First, IV stands for the independent variable. The independent variable is something that the researcher actually manipulates. They directly change it. In our Feeling Immoral and Feeling Dirty study, remember our experimenters manipulated, they controlled whether people had immoral thoughts or moral thoughts, and they manipulated that by having them write an essay about it, talking about an immoral memory versus a moral memory. The IV, or the independent variable, is generally the cause in our cause and effect sort of relationship that we're looking at. It's what we think is going to influence a different variable. We think if we mess with the IV, it's going to change scores on the DV. So when we talk about the IV, we usually talk about it in terms of levels or conditions. The levels or conditions are the actual scores on that variable that show up in the data set. So for example, if our broad variable is just what type of memories people had, there's lots and lots and lots of different possible values there. But the only scores that actually show up in the study are immoral memories compared to moral memories. So we call those levels or conditions. Oftentimes we call the people in those levels or conditions the groups. So I might talk about the immoral memory group or the immoral memory condition. They both mean the same thing. Again, the IV is what we expect to cause another variable to change. We also can manipulate the independent variable in different ways. We can manipulate it between participants. And when we manipulate something between participants, what we're doing is ensuring that each participant only winds up in one condition. So nobody remembers both something immoral and something moral. It's one or the other. Either you have the immoral memory or you have the moral memory. So each participant winds up in exactly one condition. And within participants' designs, it's a little different. Each participant experiences every condition and is measured after each one. So you might have people remember something immoral and then measure their cleaning behavior, and then have those same participants remember something moral, measure their cleaning behavior after that. We're going to talk a lot about between and within participants' designs as we progress through the course, but that's the basics. Between, you're in one condition or another. Within, you experience every condition, and your dependent variable is measured after each one. So what's the dependent variable? You can probably figure some of that out from how I've talked about it. But the DV, or dependent variable, is the effect in our cause and effect. It's what we use to measure the impact of the independent variable. It's something that's measured. In psychology, it's usually some kind of behavior, but it doesn't have to be. So, for example, in our sample study, they intended to measure people's feelings of uncleanliness. They operationally define that as taking a cleaning product. People that feel unclean, they figure, will be more motivated to wash their hands. They'll take the cleaning product. So that's the variable they measured. They didn't directly affect that, but they thought that the independent variable would change that people that remembered something immoral that they had done would be more motivated to take that cleaning product than people that remembered something moral. You can think of it as the variable that's dependent on the IV. It is affected, it is linked to that independent variable. The independent variable is changed directly by the researchers, but what they think is going to happen is it's going to cause an indirect change in the dependent variable. In designs that aren't experiments, variables, we still deal with variables, we still deal with the relationships between them, but we don't use this IV-DV term. This only comes up in experiments, but experiments is mainly what we're talking about here. So let's walk through a quick activity. So a couple of researchers are looking at the effects of hands-free cell phone sets, the sets that go into your ear, the effects they have on traffic violations and attention lapses while people are driving. They put people in a driving simulator. Notice that we do not want them actually driving around, potentially, getting into wrecks. They have half of them talk and half of them not talk on a hands-free cell phone. They measure the number of violations and attention lapses that occur when they go through that simulation. So, again, just like the last time, I'll ask the question, I'll pause briefly, and then I'll move ahead. What is the independent variable? What are the levels? Are they between or within? What are the dependent variables? There are two. What are the DVs in this case? And what is the research hypothesis? This is not spelled out. What do you think they predicted would happen? It's pretty intuitive, but see if you can guess. So we're trying to identify the IV, that's the variable being manipulated by our researchers, what levels it has, how the conditions actually differ on that variable, and if it's a between or within participants' design. Then we want to identify the DVs, the dependent variables, there are two, and then try to guess the research hypothesis. Pause for a second. Now I'm going to move ahead. Pause your video if you want to figure out the answers first, but let's go ahead. So here's our setup. What's the independent variable? What did the researchers control? Their use of the hands-free cell phone. So again, that was the variable they were interested in. This is very much applied research that we're looking at. We're looking at setting traffic policy here. So their IV, what they controlled was whether they used that hands-free cell phone or not. The operational definition was the same thing here. It wasn't a hypothetical construct. It was a very specific behavior they were manipulating. So the operational definition is the same as the variable in this case. What levels did that IV have? There were two. Half the participants talked on those hands-free phones, half of them did not talk. Notice they were still wearing it. They wanted to control everything about the environment, to keep everything consistent except for whether you're talking on that phone. This is done to make there be as few moving parts as possible. So if you find the difference you predict, you can be much more confident that it's related to that independent variable and not other things that differ between conditions. Is it between or within? Well, participants were either talking on the hands-free phone or not talking on it. So they were either in one condition or the other. That's a between participants design. In a within participants design, we would have them do this same simulator twice, once while talking on the phone and once while not. That would produce some problems, and you can think a little bit about what would happen if people did the same simulation twice. But we'll talk more about that later. What are the dependent variables? They're closely related. They are traffic violations and attention lapses, two measures of bad driving, essentially. And what is the prediction? Well, you'd expect them to think that using a hands-free phone increases traffic violations and attention lapses, thus showing that it's not about having your hand on the phone, it's about having your mind on the phone. And what they found was exactly that. People that used the cell phone that were talking had more violations and attention lapses than people who did not. All right, that's our review of variables. Next up, we will talk about part 3 and get into things like choosing a sample and some considerations that go into that. See you there.